Good evening, everyone. My name is Autumn Fox, and this is my Constructivism Assignment. What is Constructivism? Constructivism is when students are given the opportunity to construct their own meaning through their learning. The teacher is not always just giving instruction, giving lecture. The student is able to have the freedom to explore new topics on their own, and this is where the hands-on learning comes into play. Constructivism is definitely a student's hands-on type approach to teaching. It allows students to manipulate and use critical thinking, use their metacognitive thinking skills and everything so that they are able to ensure that they fully understand the concept. The spiral part of constructivism is where teachers create a big idea and it spirals down from a student's prior knowledge to being able for that student to use it in their future. The theorists behind constructivism, first we have Jean Piaget. He actually claimed that constructivism he's kind of the founder of constructivism. He said that children and learning go in a certain order. So this allows things to build on your learning. So this allows for teachers to assess what students have in their prior knowledge and build upon that prior knowledge. Then we have John Dewey. John Dewey stated that people retain information when they learn on their own and using what they have learned in real-world situations. So this is where the hands-on learning sort of takes place in constructivism. And another thing that helps me remember what constructivism involves is when you're doing something hands-on, you're constructing it. So that's one way that I remember that Dewey is one of the founders of constructivism. Then we have Vygotsky and Bruner. Both of these men suggested that students and adults and everybody learn better in social environments. So this is where the aspect of constructivism where students work in groups more instead of being more alone come into play, because Vygotsky and Bruner just people learn better from other people. You can bounce ideas off one another, and it allows you to learn more in the experience that constructivism displays. How constructivism differs from folk psychology. As Dr. Cowan suggested in the video, that folk psychology is just the traditional way of learning. So what constructivism does is it shows the big idea first instead of starting with small details and building up to the big idea. By implementing the big idea first, students are able to use critical thinking skills to break each idea down into smaller segments that will allow them to be able to understand the concept more fully. Constructivism is interactive. This allows students to they earn the role of the teacher, and the teacher is more like a facilitator in constructivism. The teacher directs the students, but the students do their own learning. And in other ways, it's interactive because students work in groups. They generally don't work on their own during constructive lessons, and then assessments. Okay, in traditional classrooms in folk psychology, teachers tend to rely more on curriculum-based assessments, whereas it's not allowing students to explain the way that they understood a concept. It's causing students to have to learn a concept in a certain way, which does not allow for critical thinking. It does not allow them to think outside the box. or be able to understand how to apply what they have learned in different situations. And then it causes more dynamic knowledge, rather than the opposite of where traditional learning, folk psychology, causes knowledge to be more just curriculum based, just right to the point, just really blunt. But by using constructivism, students are able to learn a variety of knowledge about a topic, which allows them to be able to use it later on in life, not just now when they need it in the classroom. What is the PAR model of learning? The PAR model of learning allows students to take control of their learning. The teacher is a facilitator. This is where I had spoke about this previous, about constructivism. The teacher, more or less, he or she will question students or get them to thinking about a topic so that they can take control and do experiments, think critically, create posing questions, things like that will assist them in their learning process. And one of the major contributors to the PAR model of learning was Piaget. Due to his chronological thinking of learning, the PAR model is in a certain order that allows students to use that prior knowledge that Piaget talks about in order to build on that new information. So the P stands for present, or present, I'm sorry. So whenever you present, this is when the teacher will present new content to the students. The teacher will not lecture by using this model. He or she will question students such as, what do you think about this topic? What do you think that we're going to be talking about today? What do you think humans need to survive? That allows students to get to thinking about their prior knowledge of what they know about a topic before actually diving in to see where students kind of stand. As I stated here, it allows students to start critical thinking, and students can use theories and facts. This is where things are kind of more presented to students just to kind of get that new content out there. Then students will apply. They'll apply the new material that they just were given through experimentation, through group work, through creating PowerPoints, any way that they can apply that new knowledge that they have learned. This is where the hands-on comes in to call, and where they recall the information that they have learned in the beginning of the lesson so that they can learn how they can use it for further use in their lives. And then lastly, in the PAR learning, you review. So what you're going to do is, as the teacher, you will recall former learning. So you'll just ask for some key points and allow students to share what they have learned, what they have constructed during this time. And also you want to make sure that students are able to pick out some misconceptions. So students can learn from other students. So by allowing them to work in groups, if one student has a misconception, another student can say, hey, I think that you may be kind of thinking a little bit off. And as a teacher, you can kind of facilitate that too, so that you make sure that everyone understands the concept in their own way, but in the correct way, not having misconceptions about certain things, such as some students have misconceptions that the earth revolves around the moon, just because it looks like the moon moves, or does not move, I'm sorry. And so a lot of students just have that hard misconception of that. So as a teacher, you want to make sure, that your students are able to pick those misconceptions out. Okay. An example of how I would personally use a PAR model would be through teaching science. I am a science fanatic, so I generally like to talk about science. I would use learning about mixtures in a 5th grade classroom, because in the state of Alabama, The fourth standard is investigate whether the mixing of two or more substances result in a new substance. So by doing so, I will use this PAR model. For my P, I'm going to class brainstorm. So I'm going to question my class and say, what do you know about mixtures? Have you heard about mixtures? Can you think of a mixture? By giving them those questions, it allows their brains to start thinking about the topic that we're going to be learning about today, applying it to real world scenarios. So, some kids may say, chocolate milk. Okay, that's a mixture, because if you really wanted to, you could pick those molecules apart. But that's where compounds, mixtures, and things will be brought up. And then I'll also write the students' hypotheses up on the board. So whenever they make a hypothesis on their own, and they want to share it with the class, I'll write it up on the board, so then we can go back at the end of the lesson during the review and look at those misconceptions, or which ones were right and which ones, we may want to just think about a little bit. Okay, for my A part, I will incorporate experimentation. So my students will create a hypothesis with a partner, and they will use a scientific method and use creating a mixture using baking soda and vinegar. And I may even have some other things. I may even have, chocolate mix and milk, or, water and, like those Crystal Light packets, or, things like that they can mix in water, salt and water, sugar and water, just for different pairs or different groups. And I'm going to ask them to make a hypothesis about if they think it's going to be a compound or a mixture, and why. And so they're going to use the scientific method and write that in their journal, their science notebook, because with AMSTI, I just recently learned about the scientific notebook keeping, and I feel like this would be a really good way to help them with their experimentation and by applying what they have just learned. Okay, and then at the end, we're going to come back together as a whole, and we are going to review about what we learned about mixtures and compounds, whose hypotheses were right, who needs to kind of go back and rethink it a little bit, or what other questions this has come to, or and I will ensure that I go over some misconceptions that some kids may have, because some things seem like they're mixtures, but then they're compounds, and some things seem like they're compounds, and sometimes they're mixtures. So sometimes that can be a little bit difficult. I mean, sometimes that's even difficult for me as an adult. And so I want to make sure that my students understand that. And I feel like by them experimenting, they will be able to pick that out easier because they're doing it on their own. So this is how I would incorporate a PAR model into my science classroom to ensure that I'm using constructivism in my classroom. Okay, and then here are my resources. I really enjoyed this project, and thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. Goodbye.